It's such a pleasure to bring this very special debate. We're calling it the GDP Divide because this is a split wide open over the India growth story, with economists and market players questioning the government's 7% growth estimate for the third quarter, which came bang in the middle of demonetization that saw 86% of the Indian currency being outlawed, with some even calling it the big GDP joke. So does the number reflect reality? Because anecdotal evidence seems to suggest otherwise. And who better to explain the government's position than India's chief statistician, Mr. T.C. Anand himself, who joins us right here on ET Now. We decided to change the format of the show and decided to get some of India's sharpest economic minds to question him on the data and to seek the answers that India wants to know. It's my pleasure to welcome Dr. Rajiv Kumar, now member board RBI. It's also my pleasure to welcome Mr. R. Jagannathan and Mr. Saugata Bhattacharya, who all join us right here in this great debate with Mr. T.C. Anand. Thanks very much, Mr. Anand, for being with us. And let me throw open the questions, some of which I have and some of which I'm going to let my participants ask. Rajiv Kumar, by the virtue of being the elder statesman, I will let you take the first question to Mr. T.C. Anand here.
The first question that I have from T.C. Anand is that how is the private consumption expenditure risen by more than it did in the same quarter last year, given that all indications were that consumption expenditure must be down following demonetization? So that's the first question. That's a very direct data-related question.
Right. Just hold your thoughts there, because I know Mr. Jagannathan also has a question on private investment being rising, and let me just club those questions and then you can take it on, Mr. Anand. Jaggi, go ahead and ask your question.
Yeah, first thing, I think the consumption growth is a little inexplicable, given that we thought there was a demand compression and a fall in consumption growth during the demo quarter. But how do you explain that?
Okay.
All right, Mr. Anand, you want to take those two questions pointedly on consumption rising? It's inexplicable.
Yeah, okay. Let me try to. First of all, I think it's important for people to realize that on the expenditure side, particularly on the quarterly stage, we do not have direct measures of expenditure. Except for a limited set of corporate results and some government expenditure. By and large, most expenditure data is indirect. Having stated that, let me try to give a sense of how is the quarterly consumption figure arrived at. It is principally arrived at by looking at the growth in certain production side estimates which feed into consumption. Now we know what role they play in consumption. For example, agriculture. While it provides only about 15 to 17% of GVA in GDP, it's close to 30% of the share of private final consumption expenditure. Similarly, services, particularly education and health, account for about 40 to 42% of private final consumption expenditure in services, so a part of private final consumption expenditure. Now, if you were to use it from this point of view, these segments value-added growth is known, and it's really an allocation which is being done to PFC. So the broad rules of thumb, and I'm indicating these, are based on we sort of take the growth in the segment, allocate it to different components. From that, we try to sort of work out how much would have gone to consumption, because we know proportionately what the share in consumption is. Because at this stage, we don't have direct data on private consumption. This is really the rule of thumb which is followed. So the answer to both Jagannathan's and Rajiv Kumar's question is, if agricultural output has gone up, which all of you agree has happened because of the good monsoons, base effect, all of those factors, then it must have got used up somewhere. Bulk of agricultural output goes to consumption, hence consumption must also rise. That is, right, if you like, the simple answer to their question.
I I think what the point that they were trying to make is that many people thought cash crunch is going to hit consumption. Anecdotally speaking, it has. It has delayed consumption, if not killed it, but data doesn't seem to say that. I'm going to move to the next point, Mr. Anant, and that has to be that yes, numbers could have gone up because formalization of the unorganized economy did happen. And I think Rajiv Kumar has a question there. Let me just throw to him on this part, and then I'm going to let you answer that. Rajiv Kumar, you want to ask the question that we were discussing on formalization of the... All right, go ahead, sir. Go ahead. Go ahead, Mr. Anand.
No, let me, you know, I think it is a little awkward trying to convert what are people's anecdotal expectations to estimates which are derived from fairly large aggregates of numbers. Anecdotally, you may expect a lot of things, but they'll carry the logic through. If there was such a large shortfall in demand, one should have seen prices of a whole range of goods crashing, and I think that point has been made by Surjit Bhalla in one of his pieces. So, as you know, one of the things is don't try to force an estimate to fit preconceived notions or whatever. We have given you the data. I can explain how the numbers have been calculated.
Indeed. The reason why I said that was because if you see car sales down 18.3%, this is 16-month low in December. Cement sales down 8.3%, passenger vehicle, all of that down, which is why I put forward that question. But I get your point. I am going to throw it to Rajiv Kumar for the question about formalization of the unorganized economy. You did make that point earlier. You want to expand upon that, Dr. Kumar, right now?
I have been saying all the time that you know, numbers could go up because of the formalization of the informal economy and as a result of demonetization and as bringing in of the parallel economy into the formal, you know, statistical system. But then, as just now Professor Bhanumurthy pointed out, that should have reflected much more in the two subsectors, which is trade and financial services. There, however, the numbers are down. So how come that the formalization, where is it being reflected, if at all? Is it in the manufacturing sector with the bringing in of the informal small and medium enterprises? Otherwise, you know, what explains the lower growth in trade and finance when the opposite should have been expected?
Mr. Anand, this question is all yours.
Okay, let me try to answer Rajiv by pointing out, first of all, it's I think important to understand how we estimate the informal sector, and I think there is a certain lack of knowledge about this. Broadly speaking, the informal sector can be broken up into four major categories. One large category, among the largest, is agriculture. Agriculture is almost entirely informal, and agricultural value added is estimated essentially from output data, and we get data on value added through cost of cultivation surveys. Output data is estimated from both acreage and yield estimates, well established methodology. It has almost nothing to do with the formal informal character, because acreage and yield are long standing practices of field assessments done by this Agriculture Ministry and State Department. So that's one. The second element of the informal sector, I'll come to Rajiv's point a little later, so let me finish the other one, is construction, where we don't have any direct data on construction. We estimate it on input usage, and we look at output of key construction inputs like cement, steel, and so on. Now again, since the volume of these is linked, so if formalization took place, which way did they buy their steel and cement, we don't know. But what we do know is what market data tells us is the total consumption of steel and cement, which is available also to all of you in the core sector indicators which were released. Now, insofar as Rajiv's point, it probably is showing up in one place. Sales tax collection have gone up. We've given a reference to this in the press note. You will find how much they have gone up in the April to December period as against April to October. Now, the increase in sales tax collection could be because more transactions are being routed through taxable forms. In other words, maybe through electronic forms or being recorded or whatever manner in which they are taking place. If more transactions are being taxed and more taxes are being paid, that could reflect Rajiv's point. But Please understand, what we are revealing in the segment as a whole is an aggregate comprising many elements. The references to some of the details are there in the press note. At this point, large aggregates are about the best we can give you.
Shagata Bhattacharya, you want to come in with a question on the GDP data that was released yesterday, and one that has really divided the economist community very, very sharply, and it's our pleasure to host Mr. T.C. Anant as he takes on some of these tough questions. Shagata?
Yes, I mean, I defer my questions to the learned panelists. I just want to point out that, I mean, coming in from a practitioner community, not an academic community, we see some of these numbers, which is precisely the numbers that you were talking about, that Professor Anand was talking about, and I heard Dr. Rajiv Kumar's question. So for one part, I mean, all the estimations that have happened, I mean, all the imputations of output into consumption, that all of that is showing. We need to be a little careful on this, because all the cement sales tax, for instance, we hear again that a lot of the taxes that have been paid was due to the cash that needed to be disposed of, so some taxes got paid. So I'm not very sure whether that's reflective of actual sales having increased. All of this, unfortunately, I mean, there is no data on this. I mean, which you have no way of decomposing the data. One thing I do know, coming out from the consumption, which is a little bit of a problem. For one thing, you know that consumption of jewelry, which you have, numbers that you have seen, have actually shot through the roof. So that would have contributed a little bit to the consumption, but all other consumption data for this quarter are relatively down. We were looking at the way that the manufacturing, from the output side, a lot of questions have been raised about the high manufacturing growth. So the way this is computed, and Professor Anand would know this much better than I would. So the 50-60% that comes in from the corporate numbers, the 20-25% that comes in from the IIP, and the rest unexplained. Actually, if you translate the corporate GVA, the equivalent of the GDP GVA, into the corporate, which is the profits plus the salaries and wages, I mean, that has actually shot through the roof in the last 2 or 3 quarters. So the actual GVA numbers for manufacturing is actually downplaying the numbers that you see from about the 2,000 odd manufacturing corporates. So just a little point on this.
Right. That's a fair point indeed, but Mr. Anand, I'm also going to take a question to Jaggi there, and you had a point about manufacturing, Jaggi. You want to take that on right away?
Right. One thing is, there is also high growth in manufacturing, when I think a lot of industries apparently saw some degree of slowdown. So how does that get explained? And one more related question, I think, did you expect a lot of, let's say, companies which had black money held outside coming back into the system during the quarter? Is that one explanation for reasonably surprising growth in the quarter?
Is that where money was coming from, Mr. Anand?
Look, I have absolutely no knowledge and no basis to answer Jagannathan's question about whether corporate financial results reflect money brought in from outside. I don't know. All I know is what the numbers have shown, and he and many others have written in the media about the fact that third quarter financial results have been good, and Shogoto just pointed out the same. Principally, our manufacturing numbers reflect both the corporate data, which is available to you, and for the non-corporate segment, we have used the IIP April to December now, as against earlier when we had used IIP April to October. And principally what has changed, leaving in the non-corporate segment, forget corporate for a moment, IIP April to October was -1%, IIP April to December is a plus 0.5%, or maybe minus, I forget, it's one of them is minus 0.5 and one, I think it's -1 and 0.5. Now this change shows up in the overall numbers, because going from -1 to 0.5 is a significant change. So ultimately, when you put this together, that's what explains the manufacturing growth. What are its components? How does it break up? At this point of time, it's simply not possible, because these are aggregate estimates. Disaggregated data, much more sectorally and nuanced data, will only be available when we get the fuller corporate estimates and we get the full ASI estimates, which will come much later. So at this point of time, it is the aggregate which is allocated based on whatever disaggregated data we have from previous years.
Indeed, I get your point there, and I appreciate it. I think the doubts and the questions are being raised is because people believe it's preliminary data that is being extrapolated to arrive at that number. But you know, sir, I have a question, and I'm going to also throw it to a panelist here. If you go by the estimates that you've put on, and of course, some of that has been revised for Q1 and Q2, 7.2, 7.47, which essentially means that Q4 should end at about 6.8 for us to get to 7.1 for this entire financial year. Is there more pain in the offing in Q4, I mean, given the lag effect that may perhaps be felt out of demonetization? Because I think even the government admits that some amount of pain will have to be borne by the Indian economy. I'm going to also ask Jaggi if he has a point to supplement there. Jaggi?
Actually, the question I have is the fourth quarter going to be worse? Because the secondary and tertiary effects of the slowdown may not be immediately apparent in the very first quarter of demo. So is it that in the fourth quarter you're going to see some of that as the job losses and the income drops that the informal sector faced will now start showing up in the demand or lower demand in the fourth quarter?
Mr. Anand?
Yeah, okay. Look, let me again take a cop out here. What we do is we have data for April to December. For most monthly indicators and so on, we use standard rules of extrapolation and convert them to full year numbers. It's a little more data than we had when we converted the April to October numbers to full year. Now we have April to December. We have 2 more months to give us a little more space. That full year number is then reallocated into quarters using the quarterly data which is available, and we have a sense of what the fourth quarter will be. The fourth quarter is essentially at this point residual based on this allocation principle. How will it shape up? I really don't know, because the numbers are still unfolding. The quarter itself is unfolding. I think what I do want to point out, and there, you know, fact is this estimate is based on a lot more data than the anecdotal stories, and certainly includes all the anecdotal stories as part of the data captured somewhere else. So people may have expectations that when more data comes in, it may reveal a different picture. That is always possible, because I don't know what shape the more data will do. But given the way the data has come and given our past expertise, our experience has been that our revisions are not that large. However, last year we did revise upward by almost, I think, 2 or 3 basis points in the GVA and GDP, so it could possible.
Fair point indeed. I will now turn focus and talk to you about, I think one of the reasons why people are questioning Q4 is perhaps they expect Q4 to have the lag effect. Shagata Bhattacharya, if I may raise this point with you, from the community that you come from and you track these numbers very closely, what is the consensus there? Will numbers perhaps be reflective not just in Q4? Will it spill over in the next fiscal? I was interviewing Shaktikanta Das earlier today, and he says there is no question of numbers spilling over. Are you as optimistic on this?
I mean, two minds on this. So one, in Q3, you probably saw a lot of inventories building up. I mean, so there was factories would still produce on the schedule in November, maybe even in December. So and sales were down. So some inventories would have built up. So some part of these inventories would need to be cleared, whether it's in automobiles, whether it be other consumer durables, etc. So some part would need to be. So some output till that inventory clears out would need to come down. But on the other hand, all the indicators that we are seeing, for instance, the purchasing managers indexes that we have seen right up to February, manufacturing, these seem to indicate that it's back from a contraction zone, it's moved up to expansion. Anecdotal evidence, again, I know this is not right to use anecdotal evidence, but it seems to indicate, FMCG companies have definitely indicated that their demand is back. Our internal bank data also suggests that credit card spends have come back to normalcy. So, I mean, I'm in two minds on this, but the actual data seems to suggest that output would be more or less on track. I mean, there would be small pockets here and there, and I'm not sure how they will show up in the GVA GDP numbers. But actual evidence seems to suggest that we have returned largely to normalcy.
Okay, returning to normalcy, remonetization is happening, and that's taking care of all of that. But Mr. Anand, I think one of the things that we do want to touch upon is the fact that your old series for comparison is long awaited. And I think Rajiv Kumar has a point of view there, and he has a question on that.
There is a persistent nagging doubt about the current GDP estimates based on the new series. We were assured that these will be set to rest with the publication of the back series, with the new base, which is the current series is using. How come that number, those estimates have not been produced, and is the CSO going to bring them out in short time?
Rajiv, I think you'll be aware CSO has
short time, because I think that's a question that a lot of people are asking.
Yeah, sure. Let me try to answer that. You're aware that CSO has a system where it has a whole bunch of internal referees, and our biggest challenge in trying to construct is, there are many data sources which we have used in the new series for which no real analog exists in the past. And the biggest challenge in this is the corporate data. We are now using data for over 5 lakh plus companies who file regularly. In the past, the time series which are available to us, and we've scanned through all of them, don't extend to more than 15 to 20,000 companies. We have been looking at different ways at trying to use the growth of these to match up with this 5 lakh set, and we are finding that there are lots of anomalies which come up whenever we try to do that. And because we have not been able to persuade the referees about these, and the people do an exercise, the referees raise questions, they go back and rework and try to see if they can parse it differently. This is proving to be a challenge, and I at this point am not in a position to answer will it be possible at all, because ultimately the test of a good back series is, would you be able to do this well? Now it is possible that as more time unfolds, please understand what is happening. The MCA database is building up a time series as the years go by. As we get a longer time series in the MCA database, the ability to back forecast using the MCA database onto a smaller set improves. So whether we will be able to do it, how long will it take, it's turning out to be a much more challenging question, and it's really an exercise to which there is no analog, because we are trying to take data for which there is no past. And that is much more a research exercise. It's a complicated exercise, and it's turning out to be extremely difficult. We thought it would be easy, but because we have time series from RBI, CMI, etc., but it turns out that that's not so easy as it looks.
So it's not a very easy task, will take its time. Can I ask you a pointed question, because I think Jagannathan also wants to come in on this one. How soon do we expect that to be a reality? Jaggi, do you want to add to that question?
The general GDP series, not just this quarter's numbers, but right from the time it was released a couple of years ago, has been questioned because of the sudden increase in growth rates from 4 and 5% to 7 and odd %. So people do not see a connect between what is happening on the ground, where loans are not growing, investment is not happening, consumption is sluggish, and yet growth is showing 7% odd all the time, and now despite demonetization. Is there a disconnect between the ground reality and the numbers that are shown? I think that's a question that we need to ask independent of demonetization, but in the context of it probably becomes more relevant.
And Mr. Anand, by the virtue of being the anchor of the show, I have the liberty to put in and push in one more question. I will let you answer that question, but I also have a question to ask of you. Gross fixed capital formation that was slipping for quarter after quarter, month after month, has actually gone up during the period of demonetization. Isn't it ironical?
Again, it's a good idea to see how the number is computed and what the underlying indicator is. principally this number does better because some of the indicators which are used to compute gross fixed capital formation, which is IIP capital goods and also production of steel and cement, in fact do better in the last 3 months. Now the trouble is these numbers are available to you. If you see and look at the April to December growth rates in these and compare it to April to October, if it looks better, then the third quarter number will go up. Now, for all its limitations, and I have lots of limitations of IIP which I have expressed earlier, we have to report the consequences of the number. Please understand, we do not have the luxury to change our methodology in order to generate output which suits people's predilections. We have announced a methodology, we have announced the databases, and this is where I'm answering Jagannathan. Each one of the elements of the database have been justified on its own merits and explained as to why they are better than what we were using before. What comes out in the aggregate is then a consequence. If you accept the components, the aggregate works out. I think what is happening is people are finding it difficult because they have a notion of what the number looks like. Reality in these matters is extremely complicated. Anecdotes is not reality. Your conversations are not reality. Reality is the aggregate of all of these. Now, if each one of the components from which reality is built up is correctly done, the methodological rules have been stated, the numbers are available in public domain, you will be able to recompute it for yourself. So I think it's better if you accept the numbers and try to understand what is actually happening from the numbers.
Indeed, I buy your point, but I think Rajiv Kumar was raising his hand there, and he has a question there. I'm also going to ask Saugata to come in after Rajiv Kumar has asked this question, and then take bunched questions with you. Dr. Kumar?
Is the difference between GVA at basic prices and the GDP at market prices, which is 6.7 and 7.1, I mean, is that something which is which is reasonable and compatible? Because we don't know whether GVA at basic prices in Q4 could really be down below 6%, and that would be a bit of a dampener and a shock.
Saugata, you have a question around that? Because I want to take bundled questions with Mr. Anand. We're running out of time here, but do you have a question on that?
Yes. So one request first. I mean, this massive MCA database, I think this is a gold mine of insights and information. I think the government and Professor Anand can take the lead on this. I think more insights need to be published. The RBI has done one study. I think more needs to be published on this. In terms of the investment question that Professor Anand also mentioned, I think, if you look at the capital goods, we all know of this rubber cables component of capital goods, which is the one which has been skewing the entire capital goods growth. So I'm not very sure, but I mean, together with this, there are also increases. I mean, the cement, steel production, together with all the civil works, the urban metros and things that we keep on hearing about. So it's difficult to do this on a quarter by quarter basis, and capital investment is definitely down. But you never know that. I mean, some parts, there's one project that has come in which has increased output significantly, and CMI data also seems to suggest that. So I wouldn't be completely skeptic of these numbers, but what we are doing, we do not understand a lot of the numbers, but we are trying to work backwards to see what might have led to, as Professor Anand says, what might have led to some of these outcomes that you are, the data prints that you're seeing.
So you want to take both of those points together?
Yeah, Saugata's is easy. I will certainly, I think I share Saugata's concern. I think the corporate database does need to be studied a lot more. RBI is doing a huge job, and we will certainly work with the Ministry of Corporate Affairs to try to see how more the work can be done. I think that's an important point, and I will accept that suggestion. Insofar as what Rajiv is saying, I think the difference between GVA and GDP is extremely important to understand, because essentially we derive GDP at market prices from the net indirect taxes, which is taxes and subsidies. Now, here there is a certain element which is policy driven, and there's a certain element which we measure. Insofar as subsidies are concerned, you will appreciate there is a degree of policy control which is happening, and one of the things which does show up in this data as well is between the budget estimates and the revised estimate, there is a much sharper compression in subsidies than between budget estimates of 16-17 and what was now published as RE. There has been a very sharp compression in the subsidies. This is one of the factors which has led to the growth rate being higher. It's a policy issue. Government has control over it. The second element of this is government expenditure, because nominal expenditure also figures as part of GVA. Government has also, that has slowed down GDP because government nominal expenditure growth has been compressed. Now, I think that is a valid point, and I think as policy makers, people should pay attention to both the GVA at basic prices and GDP and not only focus on one number. The taxes are also in some sense complex, because now we don't have, at least for the last year, there's been no change in rates, but the growth in taxes is reflective that there is a buoyancy in the economy. But parsing that growth, we are careful in trying to allocate it to constant prices and so on. But parsing that growth will need, and I think that will happen as we go along, people to study the tax results more carefully.
Indeed. I have time for one final question, and Jaggi, you've patiently waited for your chance to ask that one. I'll let you have the last question on the show here then.
Yes, I think many politicians believe that the upbeat data of Q3 is coming at a very politically opportune time for the government. While it's unfair to think that the CSO will massage the numbers to please the government, but do you think there is some element of truth to the possibility that the figures are coming at the right time for the government, given the massive onslaught it faced on the negative effects of demonetization?
Mr. Anand, has your number given enough to the government to brag about, and has also in turn blunted the opposition?
Look, I think, politics will have its own space, and I am not going to people take their own take on the numbers in whichever it is. As far as we are concerned, our calendar is fixed in advance, and all the things which go into the computation of this number are in fact in public domain. The figures which are used from corporate filings to IIP to tax collections are all put out and are in fact in public domain. Analysts comment on these components separately even well before the GDP numbers come out. I think what people need to get used to, because I found many analysts are actually being able to corroborate our exercises because they do internal in-house exercises putting these together, and we give you a lot of guidance in the press note itself on how that may be done. I think if that is the case, the rest about how you spin it, what arguments you take, I'm not really going to enter to that debate. But my plea is, take the numbers as they are. You've got all the components in front of you. Take a look at the full picture rather than trying to pick up one element and say that why doesn't everything else bear, because indicators in a large economy like ours will not be perfectly correlated. Some things will go up, some things will go down. It is really a question of how the whole picture comes together when you take a vast number of data together.
All right, you've been very gracious to take on some of the worst critics of the numbers that have come in and taken all questions sportingly. I really appreciate you taking time out and joining us this evening right here on ET Now. Also, a big thank you going all the way to Shagata Bhattacharya, Rajiv Kumar and R. Jagannathan. Thanks very much indeed for tuning in into the big GDP divide. Thanks, Mr. Anand, for being with us.
Find us on Facebook at facebook.com/ETNow and don't forget to click the like button. You can also follow us on Twitter at ETNowLive. To stay updated with all our programming, hit the subscribe button on our YouTube channel by logging on to youtube.com/user/ETNow.